Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal, policy, and advocacy issues involving supply chains. Find out more, visit our website at steptoe.com. On this episode, we're talking with John Gold, Vice President of Supply Chain and Customs Policy at the National Retail Federation, about current global supply chain issues. So, John, thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you on.
Hey, Jeff, appreciate the opportunity to talk today.
So can maybe we lead off, maybe you could tell us a little bit about NRF and your role there. That would be great.
Sure. So NRF, the National Retail Federation, we're the world's largest retail trade association, representing everybody from the small single store operators up to large format big box stores, online retailers, chain restaurants, and everybody in between. So, for many of you who've been home during the pandemic, most of your online shopping is probably with an NRF member, and we greatly appreciate that. So thank you. But, for retail, many folks don't really understand what the retail industry is. They think they see the store, and that's all they think about. But, retail is the largest private sector employer, representing about 52 million working Americans, about 1 in 4 jobs in the U.S. that are tied directly or indirectly to we contribute about $3.9 trillion annually to GDP. So we certainly think the retail industry is a driving factor. And me, I've been with NRF, it'll be 15 years in October, as the Vice President for Supply Chain and Customs Policy, affairs side of the house, handling all the trade, transportation, product safety, supply chain related issues. And it certainly has been a busy few years on all those fronts.
Yeah, I was going to say your portfolio seems awfully narrow. You must, I don't know what you do with your time. Supply chain has certainly been in the news these days. So, I mean, what's the current supply chain environment like for U.S. retailers?
Yeah, I mean, just like everybody else, the supply chain environment is a challenge. And I think as you all read the press on a daily basis, the supply chains are stretched to their limits from beginning to end. My members are no different than any other industry groups right now, where you are seeing challenges from the sourcing of overseas, to get goods produced in a timely manner because of just the strong demand we're seeing throughout from the consumers. So the challenges overseas, sourcing, meeting that demand, the availability of empty containers, availability of space on vessels. Once you are lucky enough to get on a vessel, you then have to sit in congestion here at U.S. ports because of ongoing congestion. Before you arrive at the terminal, you're in congestion. Getting product out of the gate is congestion. And it's a challenge throughout. Is there equipment available here in the U.S.? The chassis are a huge problem. Many of my members, they're running low inventories right now, trying to get their product and make sure that when a customer either goes to the store, buys something online, that it arrives in a timely fashion. And for the retail industry, we are now coming up on what is the most important selling season for retailers, the fourth quarter, which is when all of our holiday sales are, which is kind of the make or break period for many retailers. And with that, we're now getting into the peak shipping season, which is when all the products for holidays start to come in. Typically that peak shipping season is August, September, October. But because of the ongoing challenges that we're seeing, many companies are moving up that time frame, trying to avoid some of the challenges we're seeing, congestion issues that we're seeing. But it's going to be a challenge for the remainder of the year, unfortunately.
And you mentioned obviously peak shipping season starting, and to this point, what do you think the main causes have been of the port congestion we've seen over the last couple of months, other than I guess the obvious, which is COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is the system is just stretched to its capacity, and you're running into issues, just equipment availability throughout. You're running into issues. Obviously, early on there were labor issues because of COVID. That certainly had an impact on the workforce, both on longshoremen as well as truck drivers. And just to be honest, we've got some operations today that don't meet what we need for a truly 21st century supply chain that I think need to be looked at as well. I think for the past 2 decades we've talked about ongoing port congestion challenges that we face that are systemic. That anytime you see some kind of blip in the supply chain or any kind of disruption, you end up with these massive challenges that we see. Every couple of years, as you know, when we get into things like labor negotiations, where we see slowdowns at the ports for one reason or another, and it takes weeks to get out of that because of the challenges. So, I think part of this is we've got to take a look at how our ports are operating and look at how do we truly achieve, again, 21st century supply chain operations, being smarter about how we're using systems, making sure we have technology and visibility for better planning purposes, which I think is incredibly important, that all stakeholders need that visibility so, the truck driver knows when they actually go to the gate, they can actually get in the gate and get the container because it's not blocked off, or know that there's going to be an available chassis for them to pick up and get out, and things like that. So there are a lot of different pieces to this that we, once we get through this pandemic and just the pandemic issues we're dealing with, we've got to address the ongoing systemic challenges we face at our ports with regards to port operations.
And so, turning to solutions, potential solutions to these problems, Federal Maritime Commission, what are some of the tools that they may have to help address these issues?
Yeah, obviously the FMC has taken a look at some of these supply chain challenges over the past couple of years. Commissioner Rebecca Dye has done a really good job with highlighting these issues. Launching her innovation teams, looking at some key issues that were happening at the ports. We were part of a group that launched a petition with the FMC a couple of years ago to take a look at some of the detention and demurrage practices. That certainly has a significant impact with port congestion that are issues beyond the shipper or truck driver's control. You're getting hit with these massive charges and fees for reasons that you can't control. So the FMC put out their interpretive rule last year that we thought was a very good process. I think the whole process as a whole really opened some eyes to the ongoing issues that we're seeing at the ports with regards to congestion and I don't want to say who's to blame, but kind of what the true issues are. So I think we need to see the FMC follow up on that interpretive rule and make sure that the parties are adhering to the guidance that is out there. If not, then we need to look at how do we actually make it more than just mandatory, make it required. That is part of it. And I know members of Congress now are looking at legislation to deal with some of these issues that we're facing at our ports, both on the export side. The ag export has been very vocal about some of the issues they're facing on space availability. But then, from our perspective, again, some of the ongoing challenges we're seeing on port congestion and detention demurrage issues that need to be addressed. And, it's been 20 plus years since anybody's really looked at the Shipping Act. And time we take a look and see, does the Act today match what we need for that? Again, I hate to keep talking about this, but the 21st century supply chain that we all need to rely upon. The alliances weren't around 20 years ago when we had the 96 Act. So I think they need to be taking a look as part of that. We've got to look at the equipment issues that we on chassis that have just continued for years. Some of the intermodal issues, the rail issues that are part of that as well. And I think we've got to take a look at the supply chain holistically. And I know this goes beyond just the FMC. We've got to have that full visibility into all the challenges that hit, because again, if you have one point of the supply chain that breaks down, it impacts all these other modes that are so directly tied and so rely upon that fully functioning supply chain.
Right, and I think that was definitely something I wanted to talk about, which is potentially legislative changes and looking at the Shipping Act. What types of reforms do you think Congress should consider? And do you think there are other things that supply chain actors, whether it's the container lines, or the terminals, or labor, or others, the things that they could be doing to help as well?
Yeah, I think as far as legislation, I think that is still in the early development, early works, trying to figure out what's going to work, what's going to be saleable up on Capitol Hill. Obviously, from our perspective, one of the things we're looking at again is that detention demurrage rule, which we think could help change some of the business practices that affect detention demurrage. I think that's one of the areas where we've got to get the parties together and talk about things like free time and when fees are assessed and how that all works. This is where the FMC could convene a group to have a conversation about some of these business practices that are sorely needed. We are extremely happy to see the FMC launch their National Shipper Advisory Committee, which we think is going to be a good program that's going to allow the FMC to receive guidance and advice from shippers on what they're seeing in the marketplace. And that's really what the FMC is about, is protecting U.S. Beneficial cargo owners, both importers and exporters. Hopefully, that's going to help to advise and educate them on the issues we're seeing in the market that are not as advantageous for importers and exporters right now. So that certainly is one thing that we're taking a look at and focusing in on. Obviously, the administration is launching all these different supply chain reviews, different critical areas that we think is important to understand what the deficiencies are and where the challenges are, and then see if there is something that can be done to address them. Look, we're not always ones that call for regulation and legislation. It might not be needed, but we've got to at least get folks in a room and talk about what's going on, what the challenges are, and is there a need to update some of these business practices that could help the situation. So that is incredibly important from what we're witnessing. We've provided comments into USDA for some of the ag issues that we're seeing that our members are having difficulty with. We're looking forward to Department of Transportation putting out their request for comments. But we're also having other conversations with DOT and other officials just about the current situation and our thoughts on, what's needed to help. We've heard a lot from Gene Soroka on things like a mobility platform or a freight platform that would allow greater visibility for all stakeholders. Again, that would provide better planning purposes for everybody to really know what's coming in, when it's coming in, what's available, what workforce is available, what equipment is available. We think planning is part of that. And then also looking at how are we training our workforce for the future. I think that's incredibly important as well. That needs to be. So I think there are a variety of things that can be done. We just need somebody to really kind of serve as a leader and get folks in the room and start talking about some of these creative solutions.
Yeah, it seems like we're at a tipping point. I mean, we had, standardization of the containers many decades ago, and that helped unleash global container trade. And there was a bit of a nudge from the federal government with respect to the availability of subsidies for ships, unless they conformed with the container sizes, standard container sizes, and then everyone quickly moved in that direction. Maybe we need something similar on the supply chain visibility side, on the digital infrastructure side. Maybe not everyone's going to be using the same port community IT system, the same intermodal system, but at least they should be interoperable. Right. Because it's going to help so much with, ships coming in, the warehouse availability, truck availability, where the containers are, assuming that they all have brains on them, right? And that's another investment that needs to be made.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That interoperability is critical. And I mean, you see some of the issues now in the LA Long Beach complex where you've got 12 different terminals that are running different appointment systems and are talking to each other. And for the port trucker that's to go and check every different appointment system instead of looking at one portal, it makes it very difficult. So I think that connectivity and interoperability is critical. And look, we all understand, you've seen one port. What's happening in New York, New Jersey is a little bit different than what's happening in LA Long Beach. But there's got to be some way to address these issues. And, is a port community system, one way to address that? Yes. But we've also got to make sure you've got all the stakeholders in the room to continue to talk through the issues that we're facing, address them head on, and not, point fingers at somebody else. We've all got to take responsibility for our areas and break down the silos and work through these issues because, once you get through this crisis, people are going to forget about it and then we're going to be stuck in the same situation when the next crisis hits. So, let's address the issues now and try and address the ongoing issues that were around before COVID hit, so we don't get stuck in the same problems, in a few months when the next crisis hits. Right.
I mean, and that was my experience when you and I were, first started working on these issues when I was in commerce, and we didn't have a strategy and everything was dealt with as a one-off. And, folks would come to us, we'd raise it with the White House, we'd put something together ad hoc, we'd deal with it, and then we would disband until the next crisis inevitably happened. And I think you're right. Like right now, we have this moment where everyone's focused on it. Everyone knows about supply chain now for a wide variety of reasons. And we need to strike while the iron is hot, both in terms of funding and also in terms of getting these organizations permanently involved. I mean, in commerce, I feel like we had strong convening authority, but now they're talking about creating an office and giving them $50 billion.
Right, right.
I would have loved to have had that at my disposal when I was, running this issue, because then, you actually, can move the needle a lot more. And I haven't seen this kind of focused, this sort of whole of government proactive approach. Obviously, there are risks to that as well. If the government is not talking to stakeholders, thankfully, it sounds like they are. And I mean, I think the first batch of reports really dealt with, from the supply chain EO, really dealt with the manufacturing part of supply chains. But I think with DOT, their review is coming next, USDA as well. I think they'll focus more on the transportation systems and the risks there. I think you're right. I think we need to put forward some creative ideas for them to think about in terms of how they should be organized, what would be most helpful, and making sure they can get everybody throughout the supply chain, in the room to have these discussions.
Right, and I don't want and I think part of the challenge with those supply chain reviews, there's a lot of folks saying, well, why can't we just move all the manufacturing back here to the U.S.? And that's not going to solve the issue, and that's going to create other issues of lack of redundancy. And if one system fails here, you're down. So I think we've got to recognize that supply chains are global in nature, and we've got these trading relationships. We've got to recognize that there are these other issues that we need to deal with, and it's just on the manufacturing process. It's on the entirety of the supply chain from end where you're seeing challenges, from the manufacturing to the transportation to distribution. So you've got to look at all those different aspects and identify, again, where those choke points are and how do I work through those choke points. And it's not just by throwing money at it and building infrastructure, because that's just not going to solve the problem. You've got to look at how are you using the supply chain more creatively, more efficiently, more productively, and that's using technology and things like that. So I think that's got to be a big part of the conversation as well.
One last thing I wanted to touch on was the Section 301 tariffs on China. What do you think the prospects are that the administration, rolls them back? And do you think there's evidence that the tariffs achieved the last administration's goal of shifting supply chains out of China?
It is unclear what this administration is going to do on the China 301 tariffs, which is rather disappointing. They heard Ambassador Tai talk several times now about the top to bottom China review that USTR as well as the administration is doing. Tariffs remain in effect while that review goes on. It's unclear how long that review is going to take. We've got the whole 301 exclusion process that we have been supporting and trying to get put back in place, because the exclusions expired at the end of December, for no real reason, besides the administration saying, the last administration saying, we gave you 2 years to figure it out. Oh, by the way, we're in a pandemic for a good year of that, where there's no international travel, so how are you supposed to go out and find new vendors without being able to travel overseas? So it's unclear. We continue to push that the tariffs have not achieved their desired goal of, one, the desired goal was for China to change their practices internally on things like, forced technology transfer and IPR violations. We haven't seen the changes that we thought were going to happen. We know the bulk of the phase one trade deal was more on kind of the buying commitments on ag and other products. There was some progress made on some of the other subsidy issues that were discussed. Our hope would be that we would have already started a phase two negotiation that would have eliminated all the tariffs as well as the retaliatory tariffs from China on U.S. exports, but that hasn't occurred. We continue to push that the tariffs are doing nothing more than harming U.S. industries. I think to date we've collected over $91 billion from U.S. importers on the China tariffs alone. That money could be used for companies through the pandemic that could help them stay afloat. But instead, they're paying a 25% tax on imports of either finished goods or inputs to production, which again hurt our U.S. manufacturers that are already struggling, that continue to struggle. And that, those are manufacturers who are using those inputs to make goods here and then export them back out to another market. But the cost of goods have gone up so significantly because of the tariffs that, they're being impacted. But, we know it's going to take time to do the review, but, we've got to get some of this stuff back in place, and getting our allies in line to help on some of these issues we think is resolving some of the other outstanding trade disputes on things like the digital services taxes dispute helpful. But then we've got, we're hearing there's potential announcement coming this week on potential tariffs on Vietnam because of 301 investigations on currency and timber. A lot of companies shifted out of China to Vietnam because that was the best market available, and now you're going to hurt them for making that change. So, unclear what this administration's policy is going forwards, but we certainly hope they really look at tariffs not as your first choice of weapon, but look at all the tools in the toolbox for trade enforcement and making sure that our trading partners are living up to their commitments. Tariffs, we all know, it's not the foreign country who pays the tariffs, but it's the U.S. importer and ultimately the U.S. consumer who pays that price.
One last question. What do you think are some alternatives to the 301 tariffs that could be usefully considered? I mean, I'm wondering whether, the supply chain initiative, if the tariffs haven't been successful in changing Chinese behavior, maybe the answer is outcompete them and invest more in R&D and focus on the strategic industries like semiconductors and solar and critical materials. I mean, and batteries. I mean, is that maybe one of the alternatives to consider?
I think that's part of it, is making sure that we here at home have the ability to compete in those critical sectors, and that certainly is part of what this whole EO process and the supply chain review is to make sure we are competing. That's making sure that a lot of focus is on kind of the manufacturing of those goods here, but we've got to make sure we've got the skilled workforce that is needed for those technologies, for those industries. And I haven't seen much acknowledgement of the need to train the workforce for that. So that's a piece, a significant piece that's missing. But I think the other part here too is, we can't just go it alone against China. We've got to get our allies who all share the same concerns on board to address the ongoing issues that we're facing, competition issues. Because, we've seen going it alone doesn't work when you look at what happened under the last administration. But hopefully this administration, working with our allies, which is something they've talked about, is going to be a process forward. Maybe using that as leverage, not tariffs, is something that's going to help to get change in China.
Well, thanks so much, John, for coming on. We could talk about this for a long time.
Hours, yeah.
But I always love your insights on this, and I'm sure we'll be talking again. And really appreciate your coming on, and looking forward to continuing discussion as the tariff issues and the supply chain issues unfold. So thanks again for coming.
Great, Jeff. Thanks. Always appreciate it, and always appreciate our ongoing dialogue and work together on these issues. It's critically important, and we've got to get more folks talking about it and providing those creative ideas for the administration and others to get through these challenges.
I'm definitely looking forward to that. So that's it, everyone, for this edition of Supply Chain University. You can find this and all of our videos at steptoe.com. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.